We begin now by looking at this third major epoch in redemptive history, and it is one of the largest periods of time that we'll look at, really looking at the period from the Exodus all the way through the end of the Old Testament. And the reason we're going to look at it in this fashion is we're going to look particularly at the relationship that the nation of Israel has with regard to engagement with those from the other nations. And we're going to see that there are positive and there are negative periods of engagement, periods where Israel was faithful to obey the covenant that God had made with Abraham, but more often than not, they proved to be unfaithful. But even when they as a nation were unfaithful, there were still individuals who were among the Jewish nation who were obedient to God. And as we look at these examples, we'll trace really the flow of the Old Testament. And the intention here is to illustrate how frequently this theme of God's glory among the nations is consistently referred to. With that being said, you'll begin to understand really what the major storyline of the Old Testament is, what's God's concern for Israel's failure, but also his compassion and his willingness to show mercy and forgiveness and restore to them when they repent, engagement by way of a loving and caring relationship with them. And this is the great truth with regard to our God. He's a merciful God, a loving God. And his mercy endures forever, particularly as it's placed upon those that are his chosen people. For those of us who know the power of the gospel and are concerned to share this wonderful message with the nations, it's that great truth that our God is a forgiving God, a God who will show mercy even though it is undeserved, and demonstrate his grace in such a way that he is committed to restoring a relationship with those who have failed to worship him and to glorify him and to honor him. And this will be certainly true of the Jews, as we see, and also true of the Gentile nations. And so this is an exciting study as we begin this venture into this third epoch. By way of introduction, I wanted to share with you an observation made by Roger Hedlund in his book entitled The Mission of the Church in the World, A Biblical Theology. And this is a helpful book because it traces the same flow of Scripture and looking at God's purpose for the nation of Israel. And Hedlund makes this observation, particularly defining who it is that we mean when we refer to the nations in the Old Testament. He says the nations are tribes, ethnic peoples. They are groups which surround Israel, each with a distinctive culture and identity. Theologically, they are the peoples without the knowledge of the true and living God. And that's important for us to keep in mind because God revealed himself to the Jews. And it was their intention and responsibility then to reveal their God, our God, the God of Scriptures, to the Gentile nations who sought after substitutes, competitors, those who would be elevated, shaped in the form of the creation to compete with God for the glory that he alone deserved. And so it was the Jews who knew the true God, and therefore it was the Jews' responsibility to bear witness and testimony to the truth of Jehovah and the God that they worshiped. And so Hedlund reminds us that the people that we refer to as the nations primarily are those without a knowledge of the true God. And this is important to keep in mind because it really underscores what the intention is for God to reveal himself through the nation of Israel to the Gentile peoples. Now it's interesting as we consider what is about to transpire, where we have found the nation of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, benefiting from God's clear statement of a purpose for the nation, that they are to be a people of his own possession, adopted by him in a familial, loving relationship. He's their father, they are his children, that he entrusted them this responsibility to be a kingdom of priests, mediators between him, a holy God, and the pagan, idolatrous peoples of the nations. And of course, as we saw, it's important that they pursue holiness, live in a fashion that glorifies God and reflects him so that they can have a life of integrity as they profess him and proclaim him to them. It's interesting as we consider what they're going to experience in the wilderness and then as they enter into the promised land and conquer that land, that the land itself has meaning with regard to the unfolding of God's redemptive purposes. Particularly, we see in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 12, that Israel is placed in what is termed there, the phrase that's used, the center of the land. If you will, the center of the world. Now, many of us come from different nations and different places in the world, and we tend to be oriented from our point of reference to Israel from where we're from. But we need to think in terms of the ancient world. And what God did is he set the nation of Israel right in the center of the known world. If you study the ancient world, you'll see very quickly that the location of Israel sat right in the flow and the course of the ancient trade routes. So whether you're coming from what we term now modern day Europe, going down into the Middle East, or coming from the east and traversing down to go to North Africa, all nations had to travel down through the Jordan Valley. And so it's interesting to consider, why would God take this nation? If the gospel was exclusive to the Jews, and he desired for them to be a holy people, would he not separate them, isolate them, put them in a place of protection where they would not be tempted by the idolatry of the Gentile people? And so you have to consider, why would God set them there in the promised land, referring to it as the center of the world? Arguably, it's because he had a purpose for them. And that purpose was to bear testimony to him. And as the nations flowed through and across the land of Israel, they would encounter the Jews. And so the Jews, if you will, were set ideally in a place of maximum witness and testimony to the Gentiles. We want you to keep that in mind. Not only that, Old Testament commentators and theologians make this observation, that what we see unfolding in the Old Testament is the way that Israel engaged with the nations. Terms are used such as Israel functioning either in a centripetal or a centrifugal fashion. What that simply means is, did they draw the nations in an attractive way, or individuals from the nations to know and to follow Jehovah, or as they went outside their borders in an expansive way, did they bear witness to Jehovah? And so what we will see throughout the Old Testament is Israel functioning in both this attractive fashion and this expansive fashion. And you would know enough about the Old Testament to understand that in their history and their disobedience to God and him taking them into exile into foreign lands, we find some of the greatest examples of a testimony to the one true God before those Gentile peoples. And so keep in mind these things. God gave them a chosen land, a promised land, a home, and it was placed in the center of the world because he had a purpose for them. In addition to that, they functioned in both this attractive and expansive fashion. So let's consider, what were the occasions that we see in the Old Testament where there was an engagement between those who were the Hebrews, or eventually the Jews, and the Gentile people? Well, the first encounter that you see, of course, is Abraham himself. And this is significant. We note in Genesis chapter 12 and verses 10 through 20 that Abraham traveled to Egypt. He took his wife Sarah there, and unfortunately in this encounter, Abram was not faithful to his responsibility. Out of fear, he was deceptive and claimed that Sarah was his daughter, not his wife, and therefore didn't manifest the holiness of God or the character of God in his choice to protect himself. And so we can learn from that the importance that when we are before unbelievers, when we're before those who are idolaters, that we need to be on our guard and be mindful that our witness ultimately is at stake. As we looked at previously, we know that Joseph was taken into captivity, sold by his brothers because of their jealousy of him being the favored son. And in Genesis chapter 37, verse 28, it tells us that he was sold to the Midianites. And as they were tradesmen, they were traveling to Egypt, they sold him then into slavery, where he found himself in the home of Potiphar, eventually going to prison, being rescued, elevated to a position of great honor that would eventually lead to him rescuing his family and bringing them into the land of Egypt. And of course, the descendants then of Moses and his brothers would turn into a large slave population that God would rescue, and he would lead them out of the land in such a powerful way to demonstrate that he alone is the one true God. And we've already considered how God revealed himself through each of the plagues, that he is a jealous God and refuses to share his glory. And so we see this powerful encounter with regard to Moses and the testimony of God through the Exodus. But I want to acknowledge at this point that when Moses fled Egypt originally, because he had killed an Egyptian, he fled to the land of Midian. And as he fled there, he took a wife. Her name was Zipporah. And I want you to recall, as we think in terms of the Exodus and who was with the Hebrews as they left the nation of Egypt under God's protective hand, that joining them and traveling with them was Moses' own family, his wife who was a Gentile. And she had borne him a son. The son's name was Gershom. We see this in Exodus chapter 2, verse 21. And it's notable that the name of Moses' son, Gershom, means foreigner, stranger. Now, the significance of that is what Moses is saying is, I dwelt among non-Jewish, non-Hebrew people. And as I took residence with them, God showed favor upon me and blessed me with a son. But this son was to serve, by way of his name, a constant reminder that he was one who was a follower of Jehovah. And his family learned from Moses who Jehovah was and came to join Moses and the Israelites during that period in the wilderness. And this is important to understand, that from the outset of God's leading of the nation of Israel, there were both Jew and Gentile. With that being said, we pick up the story in the account at the foot of Mount Sinai. We've already learned that God has stated very clearly what the purpose statement is for the nation of Israel. And Moses then is called back to go up to the mountain to meet with God. And as you look at the next chapters, after the law is verbally given as a standard of God's holiness, God then begins to explain to Moses how to set up the form of worship that he was going to establish among the Jews. God explains for him how to set up the tabernacle and the priestly system and the sacrifices and all that would be expected of the Jews by way of their understanding of God's purpose in redemption, the need for forgiveness, and how that was going to be met by a sacrifice. And as we look at this time period that Moses is there with God on the mountain, we note, when we come to Exodus chapter 32, that the people immediately began to turn away. Now, this is tragic, because they had just heard from God what his purpose is for them. And it required of them that they repent from and avoid any engagement with the gods of this world. And we want to go now to Exodus chapter 32. It says in verse 1, Now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, Come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron led them, and we won't read it, but you know the account, to take up a collection of the gold that they had carried out of Egypt, their jewelry and their treasures and the things that they had all collected. And they dedicated it to Aaron, who was going then to melt it down and construct an idol. Note again, as we always see in the scriptures, and it's true still today, that an idol, a god, fashioned by man, will always take the form of some object of the creation. In this case, it is a cow. This is a golden calf. And it is fashioned in such a way that the people immediately begin to bow down and worship it. And it says in verse 6, So the next day they rose early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink, and they rose up to play. Utter idolatry, utter perversion, which often accompanies the forms of worship, driven by the flesh, both in the object of worship, but also the form of worship. And this is what we read in verse 7. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, "Go down at once, for your people whom you brought up from the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They who had been instructed to be a holy people, to set themselves apart, consecrate themselves for the purpose of worship." This is what holiness means. Failed immediately. And so God begins to speak in a firm and harsh manner. He says in verse 8, "They have quickly turned aside from the way which I commanded them. They have made for themselves a molten calf and have worshipped it and have sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt.' The Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, they are an obstinate people. Now then, let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, that I may destroy them, and I will make of you a great nation.'" How interesting. Here the nations turned away from Jehovah and the right worship of him. And God says to them, listen, they have already demonstrated their obstinance, their tendency towards rebellion. This is the state of a sinner's heart. And God wants to confront the Israelites. Moses in verse 11 appeals to God. It says, "Then Moses entreated the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your anger burn against your people whom you have brought out from the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak, saying, with evil intent, he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to destroy them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and change your mind about doing harm to your people.'" And note this in verse 13. "Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by yourself and said to them, 'I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens, and all this land of which I have spoken I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.'" And here we see the loving, merciful, compassionate heart of God on display in the face of sinners who are rebellious. Verse 14 reads, "So the Lord changed his mind about the harm which he had said he would do to his people." So Moses travels down from the mountain. Moses, also angry, confronts the nation and calls them back to obedience. His anger is evidenced by taking the stone tablets with the law inscribed upon them and throwing them down in such a manner that they shatter and they would need to be replaced. And we see that in chapter 34 of Exodus. This short account, God's purpose stated to the nation of Israel and their tendency to be obstinate and rebellious, failing to be able to fulfill what their purpose was as a witness and testimony before the Gentiles. And note that Moses understood this, because in his appeal to God, he says, "What will the Egyptians think? They saw your powerful hand. You demonstrated and certainly proved that you are the one true God. Now, these people that you rescued, if you destroy them, they will surmise that you are not the God that you profess to be." And so Moses understood very clearly what the purpose of the nation was. The people, though, quickly forgot that. And we will see this narrative, this single theme and storyline play out over and over and over again in the Old Testament. But what's important to note is that when there is a godly sorrow and a repentance and a turning back to him, he is a God who will forgive and restore. And this is the God that is unique among all the gods of the Gentile nations. Yes, if you study the ancient world and you look at the gods that they worshipped, they were characterized, just as we would expect, made in the form of the creation, to be characterized by what we see demonstrated by sinful men who hold power. They are vengeful, they are angry, they rule with such a threatening posture. But a God who is forgiving, who is compassionate and loving, was unknown and unheard of. And so God wanted his name to be known in contrast to what the Gentiles understood a God could and should be. Now, with that being said, we begin to think about the exciting period of the conquest. While they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and the death of a generation that was rebellious, God raised up a faithful man. His name was Joshua. And of course, we know the story of Joshua. We saw his faith in younger days when he went in to spy out the land. One of the 12, but only one of two, who came back and chose to demonstrate faith in a God who is more powerful than the giants in the land that they witnessed. And so Joshua eventually succeeds Moses and is entrusted with the great responsibility of actually taking the nation into the promised land. As we see Joshua rise to leadership and position of authority over the nation, we know that he understood very clearly what their purpose was, and he consecrates the people and he prepares them. And as they cross the Jordan for that first engagement with the city of Jericho, he knows that this is going to be an opportunity for God to display his power over the gods that the people of the city of Jericho worshipped. It's interesting to note that throughout the land, the promised land at that point, there were 31 city-states ruled by kings, each of them having their own plurality of gods and systems of worship within them. And what you need to understand in the conquest and the defeating of each city, city after city, was also the defeating of kings and the defeating of their gods. And so this is what is at stake as the conquest begins to take place. And we find the nation of Israel ready to engage with the city of Jericho. It's an amazing story, of course. And as we study that story, as we begin to read that account there in Joshua 8, we know that God is going to make a point again, just as he had with the Egyptians. He's going to call the nation of Israel to approach Jericho in unconventional terms with regard to warfare. He instructs them to march around the city 7 times, and then they are to blow the trumpets and break the pitchers, the clay pitchers. And that's exactly what takes place, and the walls do come tumbling down. It's notable, though, that not all who resided in Jericho, all the Gentiles who abided there, perished. If you recall, there was a woman named Rahab. And in the account of the story of Rahab, we know that she appeals to the spies when they visit her and asks that she and her family's lives would be spared. Rahab, of course, is instructed and obeys by draping a scarlet thread or a piece of fabric outside the window where her apartment was in the walls of the city of Jericho. And as Rahab obeys, we understand that that's an exercising of faith. Faith not in her gods, but the God of the Israelites. And so Rahab, placing her faith in Jehovah, is spared. She and her family. Of course, we read the account in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31, that it's Rahab whose faith was a genuine faith, a saving faith. And she is considered one who is included in, or to use Paul's language in the New Testament, grafted in to the Jewish nation. And as we've always seen, the standard, as Paul explained in Galatians 3 and what was being communicated in the Abrahamic covenant, it's those who are children of faith who are the real descendants and children of Abraham. And so Rahab and her family, Jew, no. Gentile, yes. Now they are embraced and grafted into the nation. It's interesting to account, and we'll see it when we get there, but in Matthew chapter 1, it's Rahab who's included in the genealogy of Christ. What an honor to be placed not only upon a woman, but placed upon a Gentile woman. And so in the genealogy of Christ, we actually see this allusion to both Jew and Gentile. It's a wonderful account. And we know that as Joshua began to approach city after city, we know they were defeated first at Ai until the issue of the impurity was dealt with because of the stealing of treasure and plunder. once they are purified again and God leads them in victory. And as we watch them conquer city after city, fear spread to those city-states. And by Joshua chapter 12, we see a summary of the cities and their kings who are defeated. In Joshua chapter 12, verse 24, it's named there that 31 kingdoms and their cities are defeated. What an amazing testimony to the power of the one true God. Every Gentile, every Canaanite that resided within the land that we refer to now as Israel, is a people who are confronted with the reality, who is the one true God. And so the story of the conquest is a confrontation of the idolatry of the Gentile nations. God was also purifying the land of idolatry because this was to be the home for his chosen people. So much is covered in that account of the conquest, but for the sake of time, we want to continue and just study this flow as we survey the Old Testament. We next want to consider this period that we refer to as the period of the Judges. As you begin to read the book of Judges, you begin to see that already this tension between the Canaanites who still lived in the land. We read that in Judges chapter 1, verses 27 through verses 36. That even though these cities were conquered, not all people were killed. And so there are these different people groups, these different ethnic groups that still resided within the land, the promised land. Well, we know that they would become a threat, of course, and we want to look particularly at the book of Judges, and we can turn now to Judges chapter 2. And as we look at the story of Judges, we begin to understand, even in the first few chapters, that still this is referring to that time period where Joshua is leading the conquest. And in Joshua chapter 2, we know that, we'll begin reading here in verse 1. It says, "Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord." Let's continue verse 6. "When Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land." Verse 7, "The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel." And this is the death of Joshua accounted for him and his burial. We want to go back, though, to the final pages of the book of Joshua to see more closely what actually transpires at the end of Joshua's life. It's a wonderful account. We see in chapter 3 what's termed Joshua's farewell address. And what he does is he begins to rehearse for the people all that God has done, demonstrating his power and enabling to be victorious over those in the land. At the beginning of chapter 24, it says, "Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for all the elders of Israel and for their heads and their judges and their officers, and they presented themselves before God." And here again, Joshua begins to rehearse this wonderful account. But note in verse 14 of chapter 24 what we read. It says, "Now therefore," Joshua speaking to the nation here before he dies, "fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Now that's a familiar quote to many of us. We might have it hanging on a plaque in our home or cross-stitched on a pillow somewhere or committed that to memory. This is the desire, I think, of every Christian father and mother to see their children raised in the knowledge and admonition of the Lord. But specifically, the statement is made on the occasion where Joshua is confronting the nation. He's saying that there will be a temptation in the land among these Canaanite people groups and their gods to draw you away from obedience to worshiping Jehovah. And he appeals to them and says, listen, this threat will be before you. Whom will you serve? The true God, Jehovah, or will you serve the idols of the Gentiles? And this occasion, this appeal by Joshua, here in the last stages of his life, probably the most important thing that any Christian leader could ever say to those under their care. When our days are drawn to conclusion, what do we long for the most? That with our passing, those under our leadership will remain faithful and obedient to God, who will not be drawn away by the ways of the world and bring reproach upon him, but instead be useful to him in furthering the glory and honor of his name. And so verse 16, we see the people's response. The people answered and said, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, and who did these great signs in our sight and preserved us through all the way in which we went and among all the peoples through whose midst we passed. The Lord drove out from before us all the peoples, even the Amorites who lived in the land. We also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. That's the right response when idolatry is confronted. Verse 19 reads, then Joshua said to the people, you will not be able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God, and he will not forgive your transgression or your sins if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods. Then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after he has done good to you. And the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen for yourselves the Lord to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. Now therefore, he continues, put away the foreign gods which are in your midst, and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. The people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord, our God, and we will obey his voice. And so Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and made for them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. And he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone shall be for a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord which he spoke to us. Thus it shall be for a witness against you, so that you do not deny your God. And then Joshua dismissed the people, each to his inheritance. This was Joshua's final message to the nation. On this occasion, they responded with enthusiasm and a commitment towards obedience and holiness. God had led them out of the land of Egypt with the instruction that Moses displayed and conveyed to Pharaoh, that they were to let God's people go so that they might serve him, to worship him. And here there's a rehearsing of all that God has done and an allusion and a reference to the purpose of the nation of Israel. And then it is confirmed in saying, listen, will you serve the one true Lord? This is what he rescued you for. And they commit to that. And then he sets up a memorial that was to be a reminder always for them and their children. As I mentioned, those of us in spiritual leadership, whether in our own home or as pastors or disciplers, I don't think we can find a greater testimony to a faithful life than what we read here about Joshua. It says, after he died, verse 31, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Every generation will be tempted to chase after idols that compete with God. And what we would long to have said at the end of our life is, under the period of our leadership, those entrusted to us by God, were faithful to serve him. And not only us, but the next generation. There'll be threats beyond that to grandchildren and subsequent generations, but to have said at the end of your life, for it to be true that those you led were faithful in their devotion to God. What a wonderful testimony. And so we looked at the period of the nation of Israel in the wilderness as they come into the promised land. They conquer it. Yes, there are Canaanite people who still live there, and there's still temptations of their gods. Here, they're devoted in their purpose and honoring the Abrahamic covenant. So we do come to the book of Judges, and as we read in chapter 2, we already begin to see that there's going to be a temptation back to idolatry. And by the time we come to chapter 3, Israel has turned again to lay down and to worship these idols. And so God begins to raise up judges. The first is actually the son of Caleb, Joshua's dear friend and fellow leader of the nation. And this man challenges the nation back and calls them to repentance. His name is Othniel. We see that in chapter 3, verse 9. And then there's a rehearsing of a whole series of judges, all with the same task and responsibility, a calling to repentance. As we look at the judges, there's many we could look at, but there's one that stands out to us, and it's one of the more famous accounts. It's found in Judges chapter 13. And this is the story of Samson. Samson, who'd been set apart unto God, had made a Nazirite vow. He was one who has set his entire life apart by way of holiness and service to God. He makes an interesting request of his parents, and his request is to marry the daughter of a Philistine man. Now, God had prohibited in the law from the Jews to intermarry with Gentiles. And the reason was not because of ethnic superiority. The issue was to avoid the temptation of idolatry, knowing that one's heart given to another would also open that heart up to want to please that person and to follow the gods that they worshiped. And so this is an interesting account. And as we see what plays out here, we find in chapter 14 what God allows. Let's begin reading in verse 1. Then Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. So he came back and told his father and mother, I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Then his father and his mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Go, get her for me, for she looks good to me. However, his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now at the time the Philistines were ruling over Israel. At this point in history, what's transpired is the Philistines have emerged as a very powerful people, threatening the nation of Israel. These are an idolatrous people, worshiping many gods. And on this occasion, God makes an allowance for Samson to step outside of the law and to marry this Philistine woman. Well, many of us know how the story plays out, and throughout the storyline, we see Samson being used of God to display power in physical form to have victory over the Philistines. And the culmination of his life, of course, tragically, with his eyes plucked out, bound there in the ruling house with all the leaders of the Philistines, he destroys that house, and his life is taken as well as all the leaders of the Philistines. What's going on here? God is choosing to illustrate through Samson that he is a God who will not be trivialized. He is a God who will not be despaired. He is the God of the Israelites, and he is the one true God. And there are many other accounts through each of the judges and how God chooses to make this point. But this is the primary principle, the obedience or disobedience of Israel to worship him. And this was always kept in the context of their engagement with the Gentile nations. So the Judges is an important book as we consider the storyline and the glory of God among the nations. Well, as we continue to read the Old Testament, we come to the book of Ruth. And Ruth is such a joyful and delightful story. But it begins with an interesting account of a cross-cultural encounter, if you will, between the Israelites and the people of Moab. This is a neighboring people to the Promised Land. And the account is this. There was a man who, with his wife and sons, moved to Moab. We read this here in verse 2. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his two sons are Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. And the name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her two children and her husband. So here is an Israelite woman living among Gentile people. Her sons married Gentile women. And now she is left alone as a widow with the widows of her sons. Not Jew, but Gentiles. Verse 6, the story continues. It says, Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab. For she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So they departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. It's an interesting encounter here. Naomi says to her two daughters, verse 8, daughters-in-law, Go return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, but we will surely return with you to your people. Naomi says in verse 11, Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my wombs that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they are grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. It says they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. This is a family that loved one another. Naomi certainly loved these two Gentile women. Certainly, these Gentile women had heard testimony of the God of the Israelites. And something interesting transpires here. A choice is made between these two daughters. Verse 15, Naomi says, Behold, your sister-in-law Orpah has gone back to your people, and note here, the text says, her gods. Her gods. So, what is of importance to the biblical writer here, and obviously important to God for us to know, is it's not just about distinctions ethnically. It's not just about distinctions culturally. It's primarily distinctions about who is worshipped. And so, Naomi says she's gone back to her people and her gods. In verse 16, we read this wonderful testimony by Ruth. It says, But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and listen to this, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. And when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. And it says in verse 19 that they sojourned then and returned to the city of Bethlehem. What a wonderful testimony of a Gentile in the Old Testament who, because of their relationship with those who are Israelites, made an ongoing commitment and a confession to be a worshiper of Jehovah. She understood what was at stake. It wasn't just traveling to be among those from another cultural group. It was making a commitment to serve the God of the Israelites. And this is clearly stated here. And of course, the significance of another Gentile woman in the Old Testament, who's included in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 1. The two women included are both Gentiles. And so we see that God always has demonstrated a heart, not only for his chosen people, but for those who he will draw unto himself through them to follow him. Well, the story of Ruth itself has such significance and meaning as we read the account of her being married to Boaz and the concept of the kinsman redeemer and its allusions, of course, to the picture of Christ. And so there's so much meaning here in this text as it relates to Christ himself and his redeeming work. And so that can't be overlooked at all, but we will continue as we look at these accounts' direct engagement among others. Well, as we continue to read in our Bibles, we come to the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, then the Kings and the Chronicles. And of course, these books give testimony to the raising up of a king over the nation of Israel. We meet characters like Samuel himself and being set apart unto the Lord by his mother. And we see then the people demanding a king that they wanted to have because other nations had kings, which is a exposure of their motive and their heart. They're looking horizontally by way of comparing themselves to the other nations and thinking in terms of needing a human king to lead them, whereas God ultimately is the king and sovereign ruler over them. But God allows them to appoint a king. Of course, his name is Saul. We know the storyline, of course, of where he is faithful at first, and then God blesses his efforts by way of the defeating of the Philistine people and those who were against them, these Gentile nations. We see the rising up, of course, of the young man David. And David's life is fascinating as we study this theme. We see, of course, his experience there in the Valley of Elah, where he hears the chants of Goliath, the Philistine giant. And he is standing publicly and proclaiming that the Philistines are more powerful than the Israelites. And in essence, what he is testifying to is, our gods are more powerful than your God. And so you have to consider, what was David's motivation in rushing to offer himself to go against the giant Goliath? It was the honor of God. David certainly understood the Abrahamic covenant. He understood what was at stake. And as the rest of the troops cowered in fear, cowered in a lack of faith in the God that they knew and had borne testimony throughout their history and his power over the other Gentile nations, it was David, a young man, who, not even able to carry Saul's armor because of his frame and size, takes that sling and 3 rocks. And God chooses to demonstrate his power through the weakness of a young man, and yet a young man who's characterized by faith and a conviction that God's honor should not be brought to reproach. It's a tremendous story. Of course, Goliath is killed and David conquers over him. But as David begins to engage in battle on an ongoing basis, it's Saul who becomes jealous over David. But David faithfully exercises his faith in God in battle and is quite successful. And I believe part of the success that he has is because of his commitment to point to God as the source of his strength. That was not the case with Saul. And so this young man, David, is the king that would soon ascend the throne. And as we considered before, we come and we hear the heart of David, particularly expressed in his Psalms. We want to take a few more moments and look at the Psalms themselves and see from David this understanding that God has a purpose and plan among the nations. He will not be brought to reproach. He will not be shamed. As a matter of fact, he is to be the object of their worship and can be the source of their joy. And so we look here beginning in Psalm chapter 2, for instance. It says, "Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. Verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, and saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell the decrees of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry, and you perish in the way. For his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. This is a messianic psalm. The allusion, of course, is to Christ, the beloved Son of God, who will reign as king. And he says in verse 8, surely I will give to you, speaking to his Son, I will give to you the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. Did David understand God's redemptive plan? Certainly he did. And he expresses this time and time again. We can see this in many other Psalms. We'll take a look at just a couple more. Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is this account here of a God who is not one who will forsake us, though he may fear far from us when trouble is near. But he is the God who rules and will always protect us and provide for us. And we see here in verse 27, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth will eat and worship. All those who go down to the dust will bow before him. Even he who cannot keep his soul alive, posterity will serve him, and it will be told of the Lord to the coming generations. What a wonderful allusion this is, that God will rule over the nations, and that there will be those from the families of the earth one day who will worship him. You might see this in Psalm chapter 47 or Psalm 50. We've looked already at Psalm 67 or Psalm 72, but let's just look at one more, Psalm 96. Let's read together. It says, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord, bless his name. Proclaim good tidings of his salvation from day to day. Tell of his glory among the nations, his wonderful deeds among all the peoples. For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the peoples are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and beauty are in his sanctuary. Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the peoples. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in holy attire. Tremble before him, all the earth, and say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Indeed, the world is firmly established. It will not be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. Let the heavens be glad and let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar and all it contains. Let the field exult and all that is in it. Then all the trees of the forest will sing for joy before the Lord, for he is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. Here the psalmist makes very clear judgment will come, and he will judge the nations. And so his testimony here is, be one who worships God and proclaims the good tidings of salvation, knowing that there will be those drawn to worship Jehovah. Did David understand the Abrahamic covenant? Absolutely. He certainly understood it. It's interesting as we consider then the life of David, it is the charge that he gives to his son Solomon that is going to lay the foundation in the next generation under Solomon's reign. And we see this in 1 Kings. So we want to turn there for a moment and look exactly at what David communicates to Solomon. Here David is about to pass away. It says in verse 1, as David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do and wherein you turn, so that the Lord may carry out his promise, which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons are careful of their way to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Here's David on his deathbed, and what he's saying to Solomon, as he's soon to ascend to the throne, he's saying, listen, you have one primary duty, and that is to remain faithful to God. Order your life in obedience to him, as a life that is committed to the law and the testimonies and the teachings of the statutes. These are your life, but not just yours alone. You are the leader and example for the entire nation. And so we know that David passes away, and Solomon is appointed then to not only lead the nation, but is entrusted with a very, very special responsibility. And that is to build the temple. Now, what is the temple? At this point, he's going to build what is considered to be the permanent and really the beautiful and glorious and marvelous from human standards place on earth where God resides. A place where those from the nation are to come and worship him. What a remarkable responsibility. And so Solomon does embark on building the temple. And you ask the question, did Solomon understand the Abrahamic covenant? Certainly he did. It's this occasion at the prayer of dedication where he gathers the entire nation to come before the temple. And you can imagine the scene where Solomon there is elevated at the height of the temple, the nation gathered, that he prays this prayer that we find in 1 Kings chapter 8 of dedication. We read in verse 22, then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all of the assembly of Israel and spread out his hands toward heaven. And he said, O Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing loving kindness to your servants who walk before you with all their heart, who have kept with your servant my father David that which you have promised him. Indeed, you have spoken with your mouth and have fulfilled it with your hand as it is this day. Now therefore, O Lord, the God of Israel, keep with your servant David, my father, that which you have promised him, saying, you shall not lack a man to sit on the throne of Israel, if only your sons take heed to their way to walk before me as you have walked. Now therefore, O God of Israel, let your word, I pray, be confirmed, which you have spoken to your servant, my father, David. We find Solomon on this occasion making a direct reference to David's words on his deathbed. And those words have everything to do with about being faithful and obedient to God. Now, as Solomon continues to pray, he invites the nation of Israel to enter into the temple and to be faithful in prayer and intercession and making supplication. And we see this in verse 33, when your people Israel are defeated before an enemy because they have sinned against you, which is interesting to note that. This has already been a recurring pattern. If they turn to you again and confess your name and pray and make supplication to you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them back to the land which you gave to their fathers. This is what a wonderful, hopeful prayer. Solomon is saying, listen, even when you fail in remaining obedient to God and your responsibility as a testimony, when you repent, he will forgive. And so you can expect here at the dedication of the temple that Solomon's primary focus is the audience of Israelites who are gathered around him. And yet, in this very prayer, on this public occasion before the entire nation, we also know Solomon there in verse 38, it says, with his hands spread towards this house, he says, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, and forgive and act and render to each according to all his ways, whose heart you know, for you alone know the hearts of all the sons of men, that they may fear you all the days that you live in the land which you have given to your father. Now listen, verse 41. Also concerning the foreigner who is not of your people Israel, when he comes from a far country for your name's sake, for they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and of your outstretched arm. And when he comes and prays toward this house, hear in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name, to fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have built is called by your name. Amazing. In the dedication of the temple, Solomon is not just declaring that this is to be a place of worship for the Israelites, for the Jewish nation. It's to be a place of worship for even the foreigners, the Gentiles, who come and submit themselves to God himself. It's interesting then as we study even the design of the temple. There are multiple courts and areas within the temple, but it's notable that one of the courts is entitled the Court of the Gentiles. Now, this will become later when we see the life of Christ and particularly look at the portion of the temple that he cleanses. But here on this very occasion, as the temple is dedicated, Solomon is acknowledging that foreigners are welcome. So welcome that even a portion of the temple is named and dedicated as a place where Gentiles and foreigners are welcome to come and to participate in the sacrificial system and expression of faith in Jehovah. Amazing. Does Solomon understand the role and responsibility and the purpose of the nation of Israel? No question about it. It's interesting, not only on this occasion, but just a few chapters over, chapter 10, we see another opportunity that Solomon has to be a testimony, if you will, to Jehovah before a Gentile individual. Chapter 10, we read the account of the Queen of Sheba. Queen of Sheba coming from another nation. She heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, and she came to test him with difficult questions. So she came to Jerusalem with very large retinue, with camels carrying spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. And Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was hidden from the king which he did not explain to her. And when the Queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters in their attire, the cupbearers and his stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. And then she said to the king, it was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. She goes on to say, nevertheless, I did not believe the reports until I came and my eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard. She goes on to speak of how his men are blessed. But note in verse 9, she says, blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness. And it says that she just lavished on him wealth of gifts that she carried with her, gold and spices and all these things that she entrusted to him. She carried shipfuls of treasures and laid them before him. It's an amazing story. But notice that the one that the Queen of Sheba credits for wisdom, Solomon, and him being placed on the throne is not Solomon by his own human effort. It's the God that Solomon worships. Verse 9, blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you to set you on the throne, because the Lord loved Israel forever, and therefore he made you king. What is she actually saying here? She's acknowledging that the God of the Jews is a God that's different from the gods that she worships. It's a God who's actually is loving and has the best interest and concern for his people. How wonderful is this? As a matter of fact, we're going to see in the life of Christ in his own preaching ministry, he makes reference to the Queen of Sheba as one who has genuine faith. And this is important for us to note here. A Gentile? Yes, a Gentile. Now, having said that, it's important that we continue because something tragic transpires. And what transpires next is Solomon, the one who constructed the beautiful temple and dedicated unto God and had a testimony among the Gentile nations. It says in chapter 11 that the King Solomon loved many foreign women, included among them the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittite women. And from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Associate refers to marriage. Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully as David his father had done. Goes on, gets worse. Verse 7, then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. The tragedy of this account is the turning of Solomon's heart away to these foreign gods. And now what he does is he constructs on the hills surrounding the temple to Jehovah, temples to their gods. He constructs for them temples for the worship of their false deities. What Solomon does on this occasion is he undoes all the effects of the conquest, the purging of the land, and while there were Canaanites that still lived in it and they still worshiped, there was a commitment as the national leader and the head of the nation to pursue obedience to God. And now he, as king, invites these gods back in, and he establishes here what we would call today religious pluralism. God is displeased. So much so in verse 9 we read, now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give you one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. It's at this point God brings judgment upon the nation of Israel. It will soon seem that the kingdom is divided. And what ushers in then is the rule of kings who are unfaithful to God, kings and queens who were idolatrous people, and the nation utters into this dark period, a period where they're no longer able to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant. As we continue looking at the storyline of Scripture and following on then with regard to the dividing of the kingdom, we know, of course, that we see immediately a king named Ahab and his wife Jezebel, who are then appointed as leaders over Israel. And what's tragic about this is they build on what Solomon has done and now particularly formalize the worship to the god Baal within the national system. And we see this in 1 Kings chapter 16. But it's interesting what occurs during this period of time, that there still is a testimony, a particular testimony by two men, Elijah and Elisha. And I want to look at these two examples because they also are alluded to by Christ in his public ministry. So in 1 Kings chapter 17, we find this account of Elijah. And it says in verse 8, "Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon." This is a Gentile area. "And to stay there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." So he rose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Please get me a little water in a jar, that I may drink." And as she was going to get it, he called to her and said, "Please bring me a piece of bread in your hand." But she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in the bowl and a little oil in the jar. And behold, I am gathering a few sticks that I may go in and prepare for me and my son, that we may eat and die." Then Elijah said to her, "Do not fear, go, do as you have said, but make me a little bread cake, and from it first, and bring it out to me, and afterward you may make one for yourself and for your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor shall the jar of oil be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain on the face of the earth." So she went and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The bowl of flour was not exhausted, nor did the jar of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke through Elijah. An interesting account to include in the text of Scripture here. The disobedience of Israel, their following after Baal, Elijah's public ministry of confronting this. God calls him over here to a woman referred to as the widow of Zarephath. And because of the drought and what's happening at the time, she has very little grain and very little oil, and frankly is preparing her last meal with the expectation to die. This is a woman at the end of her life who really has no hope and confidence that she has the ability to sustain life. And here comes this man, Elijah. And Elijah says to her, "Listen, the Lord, the God of Israel, is saying to you, go and take the bowl of flour and make this meal for me. And if you do this, the flour will not be exhausted and the jar of oil will not be empty until he sends rain upon the land." So let's consider for a moment what was happening in this story. This woman is faced with the dilemma: keep what I have, the little I have, and feed me and my son and then die, or to believe the word of Elijah. And not just the word of Elijah, but the testimony of Elijah's God, the God of Israel. And here we see her choosing to put her faith in the God of Israel. And she goes ahead and prepares him a meal, and God fulfills his promise to her. And he makes sure that she has enough to eat until rain comes again. Jew or Gentile? This is a Gentile woman. And what is she doing? She is evidencing genuine faith in the God of the Israelites. And we know Christ is going to affirm this as well, of genuine faith. And so here again, we see this opportunity for this man, this prophet before the nation, who is concerned about the glory and honor of God, not just among the Israelites, but even among the Gentiles. One of my favorite accounts of Elijah, though, in this regard, and challenging the idolatry of pagan people, is found in the next chapter, 1 Kings chapter 18, and you would know this account. I'm sure it's familiar to you. Elijah finds himself there on Mount Carmel, and there is a contest that is about to be waged. And the contest is ultimately to demonstrate which God or whose God is the most powerful. The God of the Israelites, Jehovah, or the God of Baal. So Elijah poses this contest. The contest, the terms of it are accepted. And what plays out, of course, is this building of altars in a very public, elevated place where all can see. So it's a very public experience, a public contest. And so the prophets of Baal go through all of their machinations and worship rituals. And as they pray and ask Baal to send down fire to consume the altar, what happens? Nothing. Their God has no ears to hear or eyes to see. And so Elijah then comes forward and he takes center stage, and he states that we're going to make the contest even more challenging. We're going to prove a point here. And so in this public contest, he wants God to demonstrate that he is truly God. And he exhorts those there to pour water, pitchers of water, over the wood and the altar. They said, don't do it once, but just do it a second time. And not just a second time, but a third time. And it says in verse 35, the water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. And here we go. Elijah, center stage. It says, verse 36, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their back. And that you have turned their heart back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Then Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape. So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slew them there. Again, another public testimony to the power of the one true God, directly poised against the false gods and object of worship of these Gentile people and the Israelites who had embraced Baal worship. Elijah was faithful to give testimony to who God was. And so Elijah, we know, has these opportunities to bear witness to Jehovah. Well, his successor Elijah, we find in the book of 2 Kings chapter 5, a very interesting account. Elisha has his own challenges by way of prophesying God's judgment against idolatry. In 2 Kings chapter 5, this really unexpected experience takes place. It says in verse 1, now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master, and highly respected, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, thus and thus spoke the girl who is from the land of Israel. Then the king of Aram said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. He departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 changes of clothes. It's interesting here. What we find is this little girl who has been taken captive. She's an Israelite, and her Gentile master has leprosy. And she gives testimony to him and says, listen, you need to find a man named Elisha. He knows a God who has power to heal. And so Naaman is sent then there into the land. And it says in verse 8, it happened when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent word to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean. But Naaman was furious and went away and said, behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. And so Naaman is angry at this point. Now eventually, as we find in verse 14, it says, so he did go down, and he dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. It's interesting, the commandment for him to go and to dip 7 times in the Jordan River. You might think that one dipping in the water would be a step of faith and hope that the God of the Israelites would heal you. But by the time that you have to dip down in the river the seventh time, you would be tempted to be doubtful, suspicious, anxious, abandon this ritual that you've been instructed to follow. But instead, what we see him do is he perseveres and dips the seventh time and is raised up and is then healed. Christ, again, will point to Naaman and saying, this is a man of genuine faith. And so the testing of his faith in the God of the Israelites was the testing of having to do it 7 times. And Naaman evidenced genuine faith and was healed by the God who only had the power, or was the only God who truly had the power to heal. Interesting account, embedded again in the life of this prophet who was calling the nation back to obedience. Well, we don't have time to look at every account in the Old Testament, but I would argue that you could find references in every book of the Old Testament to an understanding of God's purpose for the nations, whether that be judgment or salvation. You would find many more examples of direct testimony before Gentiles. And one of them I want to look at right now is the testimony of Daniel. You can almost anticipate that knowing what we do know about the story of Daniel, but I want us to look at it because it's powerful and it bears tribute to this very principle that we're studying. We know what transpires here. The nation of Israel, because of disobedience, is being led away captive. And so we see in chapter 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Now stop there. This was common practice. When one nation defeated another nation, they would take what they had stolen as tribute and bring it back into the house of their gods. By bringing it back into the house of their gods, this was an occasion for them to actually demonstrate that their gods, paying tribute to them, were the ones that granted victory. In essence, it's expecting and giving tribute to the fact that their gods defeated the God of the people that they conquered. So that's what is taking place here in Babylon. It says, verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring to some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. And so what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here is he's taking the cream of the crop and he's bringing them into his own palace. And he is going to educate them. Educate them in what? Biblical truth? The testimonies of Scripture? No. It's not a teaching in the law. It's in the teaching of the literature and language of the Chaldean people. He's going to attempt to change their worldview. He's going to attempt to influence their thinking to think like the Chaldeans. He goes on to say in verse 5, the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food, and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter into the king's personal service. And here's where we meet our friend Daniel. Verse 6, now among them, from the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. To Daniel, he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now I want you to note what's stated next in verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice of food or with the wine which he drank. Keep in mind, these were Jewish young men who were abiding by the dietary laws of the Old Testament law. And these laws were intended to remind them that they were set apart, set apart from the Gentile nations unto God himself. And this is a commitment that was a physical expression of their spiritual commitment to holiness. Daniel understood this. And it says that he made up his mind that he would not then defile or desecrate himself with the king's choice food or wine. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then he would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So Daniel strikes a bargain, or if you will, he frames a contest. And what he's saying is at the end of 10 days, if you allow us to eat vegetables and to not eat of the king's meat and wine, let's see who really is healthy and strong and fit at the end of these 10 days. And so it says that, verse 15, at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. And as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. And so what we see in the next few verses is they are eventually presented to the king. And it is affirmed that they are healthier and they are stronger and they are wiser. And it would be the case that these 4 young men, because they kept themselves set apart from God in the context of a Gentile nation where they could have partaken of all the king's luxuries and privileges, they remained set apart and consecrated to God. And because of that, he allowed them to be raised up to a position of great influence in the courts there of Nebuchadnezzar. Now in the next couple chapters, we read the account that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And this dream is a really vibrant dream. It's a vivid dream, I should say. And it's one that is going to promise to Nebuchadnezzar that he's going to be utterly humiliated. But nobody in his court, as far as the wise men around him, can interpret this dream. But because Daniel is trusted, he's brought in. And Daniel then begins to serve Nebuchadnezzar. Now, before we get into the next dream and what transpires, we see here that Daniel and his friends have an interesting choice, because Nebuchadnezzar, now the most powerful king of the most powerful nation ruling over the earth, very much like what we saw with Pharaoh and the nation of Egypt, which was the most powerful nation, decides that because of his great accomplishments and because he himself desires to be worshipped, which is always the issue, he is going to have an idol made and erected on a plain, and is going to command all peoples to bow down and to worship him. This is what we find in chapter 3. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. It says that they all came. In verse 4, then the herald loudly proclaimed, to you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. What's this reference to? Because they had conquered all these other nations, they were gathered there as well, or at least representatives of their populations were there. O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and what? Worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Well, did everyone bow down? No, because what we begin to see in the next few verses is in the distance, there were three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refused to bow down. The king, of course, is in a rage, it says in verse 13, and in his anger gave orders to bring them to himself. And he then tells them, because of their disobedience, and specifically, he says, because you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up, are you ready now to be thrown into the fiery furnace? See, the issue is worship. And these three young men were devoted to God. And so in verse 17, it's interesting, we read Nebuchadnezzar says, if it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able, this is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They replied to the king and said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Did Daniel and his friends understand the Abrahamic covenant? Absolutely. Did they understand, even though they were taken captive and even have positions of influence and honor among the Babylonians, that they had an opportunity to be faithful to their witness to God? Yes, they did. And they were faithful because they knew what was at stake. It's not position, it's not wealth, it's not power. It's the glory and honor of God himself. And so these young men, these faithful men, said, listen, we will not bow down and to worship your gods or this image made in your, this statue made in your image. And you know what transpires? He throws them into the fiery furnace, and yet God is present with them. And he is stunned and shocked that the hair of their head, though it was singed, and there was no damage to their body. And he says in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Did he understand? Nebuchadnezzar perfectly understood. And so in this contest, the ultimate test, the threat of their own lives, they prevail. And even the king recognizes that their God, the true God, is the one who rescued them. And so it says in verse 4, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Now, you would think that would be the end of the story, and yet Nebuchadnezzar is still filled with great pride. And even though he knows that the God of the Jews is the true God, and even though he's made this public profession, God's still not done with him. And so he now has a dream. And in this dream, he is promised that he'll be utterly humiliated. And he brings Daniel in again and asks for aid to interpret this vision. And this brings us to verse 28 of chapter 4. And this is amazing. It says, all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. Now keep in mind, one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world were these palaces that Nebuchadnezzar had built. If you ever have opportunity to visit a museum where you've seen portions of the Ishtar gates, which were the walls of Babylon, embedded in those beautiful blue glazed tiles of this massive city, the wall that surrounded it, are the images and the forms of the gods that they worshiped. And as Nebuchadnezzar rose to the heights of his own palace, and he surveyed this great city, this is the experience. Verse 30, the king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" This is the pinnacle of Nebuchadnezzar's pride, taking credit for all that he's accomplished. In his smugness, verse 31, it says, while the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you'll be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field, and you'll be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize what? That the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes." Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. And he was driven away from mankind. He began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. Nebuchadnezzar, standing there at the heights of his palace overlooking the city, at the pinnacle of his own pride, he who had built an idol to have others bow down and worship him is attributing to himself all the power and the ability and the might to accomplish what he's done, never acknowledging that it was God who allowed him to do this. And God takes him from that pinnacle of pride to abject humiliation. A picture of crawling on your belly, not having the ability to even care for your own body and your hygiene, the growing of the hair and your nails, all of this is such a vivid picture of one who doesn't even have control over their own bodily functions. So from the heights and pinnacles of pride to abject humiliation. But that's not the end. Verse 34. This is wonderful. It says, "But at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom, and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me." And now, this is Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. "I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." And here, this Gentile king, because of the faithful witness and testimony, and certainly because of God himself and his work in his life, Nebuchadnezzar publicly proclaims that the King of heaven, the God of the Jews, is the one true God, and the God that has restored to him his position and his greatness. What a phenomenal testimony from a Gentile. And so the story of Daniel itself just has so much to offer us with regard to the obedience of these Jewish men in what we would term an expansive force, outside of the land of Israel, the promised land, Jews being faithful. There's much to consider here still in the book of Daniel. Of course, we enter into a portion of prophecy which looks forward. And part of that is also looking forward to Christ. And it's likely, based on my own study, that even the Magi who would come to bow down and worship Christ most likely knew about the prophecies and the predictions from the time of Daniel. And it was they who came from afar at the birth of Christ who had awaited the promise of one who would come, a king who should be worshiped. Daniel, what a wonderful testimony. Well, there are others who are faithful. We might think of the story of Esther This book is found earlier in the Old Testament, and just to touch on it briefly, here, again, Israel is dominated and influenced by the Medes and the Persians, and it's the king of Persia who is married to a woman named Vashti. And it's determined in that account, as you go back and look at it, that this little Jewish girl, whose uncle Mordecai has influence and brings her to compete in this beauty contest. This little girl, who's an orphan, has no value or merit in the culture and context of the Medes and Persians. And she is elevated to the position of queen, where she has access to the king himself. As you read the wonderful account of Esther, you see that God used her to preserve her people, because God had promised that he was going to preserve his people. And here, before these Gentile leaders, and even the threat of death by Mordecai, and the account then of him and having his life threatened, Esther exercises faith, approaches the king, and in the end preserves Mordecai's life, but also preserves the entire nation who was under threat. Go back and read Esther 6 through 10. And my point here is there was a feast that's still celebrated today by the Jews. And this feast is called the Feast of Purim. And it is one of the feasts that is annually practiced still today by Jews. And what it is a testimony of a young Jewish girl in the context of Gentile rulers who God granted faith and used to be faithful to preserve her people. God always honors those who are committed to him. And even when we're opposed by enemies, those who are idolatrous, those who are at war, those who are in opposition to the truth and to our God, if we trust him, he will use us also with regard to giving testimony to him. Well, we could look at the book of Hosea, for instance, and the storyline of Hosea, of course, is that of the unfaithfulness of Israel. And the whole imagery there, of course, of Hosea, who takes a wife, Gomer, who is a prostitute, and even though there's a covenant made between Hosea and her, she continues to adulterate herself, turns back to her adulterous ways and fornication, and violates that covenant. And yet the imagery of Hosea, which is a picture of God, who continues to pursue and continues to show kindness and mercy and compassion, is itself the storyline of the whole Old Testament and God's continued commitment to the Jews. And so salvation to the Jews and to Gentiles continues to be a theme, but also the confrontation of their idolatry. Because when you embrace idolatry, you cannot fulfill your call as a testimony or a witness to God. Well, let's just talk about maybe one more account from the Old Testament, and that would be the story of Jonah. And Jonah, of course, is well known and criticized for his failure to not obey God's call to go to the city of Nineveh. But again, this is an account that's often mistaught or overlooked, and it's important that we take a look at it, particularly from the text. So let's look at the book of Jonah for a moment. It says in verse 1 of chapter 1, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." Now, Jonah is asked of God to go and confront the impurity, the immorality, the idolatry of the people of Nineveh. But Jonah, it says in verse 3, rose up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, paid the fare, and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Now, Tarshish is in what we know today as modern-day Spain. And it is the case that it's the opposite direction of Nineveh. Now, often, as this story is taught, it is explained that Jonah's motivation for not going to Nineveh was one of fear and dread. And that's easy to consider being the case, because if you knew the reputation of the Ninevites, they were a ferocious people. When they would return from battle, from those that they conquered, they would return with the heads of their generals on spikes as they marched back into the city of Nineveh. Not only that, they would skin and drape the skins of the people that they had conquered on the walls of the city of Nineveh. They did this to intimidate, to create fear. And so it's easily understandable why people would assume that the motivation for Jonah in not going to Nineveh was fear itself. And we know what happens. Jonah boards a ship, a storm arises, he eventually is tossed into the sea, swallowed by a great fish, spit up on the shore, and then again is given the opportunity to obey and go to Nineveh, which he does. And this is where we need to focus in on the story to pay attention to what was really going on in the heart of Jonah. And this has great implication for us to understand what the attitude and the mentality of the Jewish people were towards Gentiles at this time in history. Verse 1 of chapter 3 says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to it the proclamation which I'm going to tell you.'" Here's the message. "So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3 days' walk." Now just stop there. This is a massive city. We estimate, as a rule of thumb, that a 1 day's walk is about 20 miles. So this is a 3 days' walk, massive city. And it says here that Jonah began to go through the city 1 day's walk. And he cried out and said, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown." So Jonah was given a message by God of judgment. If they don't repent and turn from their idolatrous and immoral ways. Verse 5, "Then the people of Nineveh believed in God." This is a Gentile city, a Gentile people. It says the people of Nineveh believed in God, and they called a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. And when the word reached the king of Nineveh, he arose from his throne. He laid aside his robe from him and covered himself with sackcloth and sat in the ashes. He issued a proclamation, and it said, "In Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let man, beast, herd, or flock taste a thing. Do not let them eat or drink water, but both men and beasts must be covered with sackcloth. And let men call on God earnestly, that each may turn from his wicked way and from the violence which is in his hands. Who knows, God may turn and relent and withdraw his burning anger, so that we will not perish." Did they get the message? Absolutely. They were under judgment. And here what we see here is that from the king all the way down to every caste and level of people, the leaders, the commoners, the workers, all of them demonstrate a heart of repentance. And verse 10 tells us, when God saw their deeds, that they turned from their wicked way, then God relented concerning the calamity which he had declared he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. What you read in chapter 3 of Jonah is a report of the greatest revival recorded in Scripture. And it's a revival that occurred among Gentile people. It's an amazing, amazing account. And we know God is the one who turns the heart. God is the one who grants faith. God is the one who calls people unto himself. Yes, Jonah was the messenger, and we can certainly understand that those of us who are called to cross-cultural ministry and to reach the nations are the messengers. We are the ones that proclaim the good news of peace. We are the ones that preach the gospel. And so while Nineveh is faithful here, while Jonah is faithful here, we recognize that Jonah still has a heart problem. Would you not expect, having experienced and even be used of God to be a part of this great revival story, that you would be exhilarated with joy, professing gratitude and praise and thanks to God? Any missionary would love to have this kind of experience among the people they minister to. And yet, chapter 4 begins with this word, but. But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. Why would he be angry? Well, here now we understand what his motive was in going to Tarshish the first time. Verse 2, he prayed to the Lord and said, "Please, Lord, was not this what I said while I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this," what's this? This revival, this coming to faith in God. Isn't this what I said while I was still in my own country? In order to forestall this revival, I fled to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity. And here's his request. This is how upset and angry he is that God rescued and redeemed these Gentiles. He says, "Therefore, O Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life." And the Lord said, "Do you have good reason to be angry?" See, at this point, because of the disobedience of the Jewish people, time and time again, having been disciplined by God by imposing over them unjust, ungodly, idolatrous Gentile rulers, the Jews came to hate Gentiles. And the one thing that the Jews possessed was the favor of God, and certainly his promise of blessing and redemption. And what Jonah wants to do is to withhold the blessing from the Ninevites. The complete antithesis and opposite of the Abrahamic covenant. The complete opposite of the purpose statement we read in Exodus chapter 19. The complete opposite of what David understood and articulated in the Psalms, and even his son Solomon, before his failure, prayed publicly before the nation. What so many before him understood. Jonah wanted to withhold the blessing. And that attitude came to characterize the nation as a whole. And so the Jews at this point begin to entertain the idea that yes, there would be a Messiah. There would be a promised one who would come, but he would come exclusively for our benefit. And he would come to free us from Gentile rule with regard to human oversight and be a king to us. And when you understand this mentality of the Jews, you begin to understand exactly what Christ was confronting in his earthly ministry. There was a complete absence within the land of an understanding of the purposes of God and what he wanted to do for and through Israel. Well, if we had time, you could go back and look at the major prophets. You might look at Isaiah, and particularly look at Isaiah chapter 45 or chapter 49, where even Isaiah speaks of being a light to the nations. You might look at Jeremiah and even look at chapter 33 and particularly verse 9 there, and understanding that God's promised judgment that was going to come. In essence, he recognized the need to be a prophet, not just to the Jews, but to the nations. You might go to the minor prophets, and you could look at Micah and see in chapter 4 how God was going to address the issues of the nations there. And then, of course, in chapter 5 and verse 2, we have that wonderful text that promises that there will be a king, a ruler who will come out of Bethlehem. And so the minor prophet Micah has much to say with regard to God's purposes in redemption, and particularly the coming king. You could go to Habakkuk in chapter 2, verse 14 or verse 26, and see the same references to the nations and God's plan for them. Sometimes it's a plan for judgment because of their disobedience and idolatry. Haggai 2:7, where we see there under the reign of Darius, and Haggai speaks of returning and the rebuilding of the temple and the promise of those who will worship in that temple. You see in Zechariah chapter 9, verses 10 through 13, also speaking this message that relates to God's purpose of being worshiped among the nations. And then finally, we come to the end of the Old Testament canon, Malachi chapter 1, verse 11, or even chapter 3, verse 12, and these references, of course, to God's plan for the nations. So, what do we understand from the narrative of the Old Testament? What is the grand theme and the great storyline? It is this. It is that God has a purpose for the nation, and that is to exalt him among the Gentiles. But sadly, at this point, in the close of the Old Testament canon, the condition that faced Israel was this hardening of their heart towards the Gentiles. It's been said by one theologian, the whole Old Testament lives in a missionary atmosphere and is vivified or brought to life with the love of God for the whole earth and for all his children. And we can rejoice that this is the testimony of Scripture, and this has been his plan from the beginning. For those of us who study missions or understand the call to be faithful by way of evangelism and outreach, it's easy for us to think only in terms of Matthew chapter 28 and the Great Commission passage, or think only in terms of the New Testament and the unfolding of the missionary work of Paul and those who joined him in that effort. But that's not where the plan of redemption begins. It began in Genesis chapter 3 and unfolds all throughout the Old Testament. Now it's interesting, we go into this period referred to as the intertestamental period. And I just want to make a note here before we come to the next epoch, which will be under the heading of Christ. But the intertestamental period was a period of time where the Jewish people continued to be ruled over. And at this point, it was being ruled over by the Roman world by the time of Christ. And because of persecution, there was a scattering of the Jews. And the Jews took up residence in all of the countries and all of the cultural settings around the Roman Empire. And it was during this time that faithful Jews who did want to honor God and Jehovah would build a house of worship. We call them synagogues. And it's interesting to note that this was happening during the intertestamental period because of the scattering of the Jews, because eventually we'll see that the Apostle Paul honored the principle of taking the gospel first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles, that when he entered into a city, the first place he would go would be to the synagogue. And it was synagogues that were built and constructed during the intertestamental period that actually allowed Paul to meet there and to make the appeal for the gospel to his own people first. And so the intertestamental period is important for us to understand as far as the unfolding of God's plan for the nations.